Microphone.
All right,
I know this is now.
great.
Okay, let's just admit Annalisa.
All right, everybody. Hi, we are still letting folks into the meeting, but we're just about ready to get started. And Sam, I see you have your hand up. I'm hoping you can unmute yourself, but if not, we will send that to you, or can we unmute him?
You should be able to unmute
Unmute
himself.
him.
Just in case.
Unmute Sam.
Just-
Yeah. Sam.
Yep.
Thank you very much. If you could name me as a co-host, that would be lovely.
So quick for this.
There we go. There.
All right, there we go. Thank you, everybody, for joining today. Really excited to assist with this first meeting of the second statewide agricultural expert panel working group. These meetings are really kind of fundamentally different than the other venues that we've had so far, including the public listening sessions and, of course, the formal panel meetings themselves. Before we jump into the agenda, though, I'd like to hand it over to Mark Gutierrez. Mark is going to lead the team providing interpretation services today. Mark, if you'd like to run through instructions on how to join in Spanish.
Thank you, Sam. Yes, indeed, we'll do that now. And if we take a look at our following slide, we have some language access instructions, which we'll share in both English and Spanish. We'll start with Spanish. Buenas tardes a aquellos que nos acompañen el día de hoy. Queremos dejarles saber que tenemos interpretación al vivo disponible para la sesión. Si desea escuchar en español, por favor, busquen la parte inferior de su pantalla un icono de un globo terráqueo que dice Interpretation o Interpretación. Selecciónelo y de ahí seleccione su idioma Spanish o español. Y podrá escuchar el programa enteramente en su idioma, claro. Y si desea, puede silenciar el audio original por tocar Mute Original Audio. And for those listening in English, in the event there's a Spanish comment or a question, you can also listen to a live interpretation of it by selecting the globe icon at the bottom of your screen that says interpretation and then selecting English. And you'll be able to hear a live rendering of that comment into English. As we go on to our next slide, we have options on how to find the presentation in your language of choice. Again, we'll share in Spanish first. Igual usted puede encontrar el idioma, o más bien las diapositivas para hoy en el idioma que desee. En la parte superior de su pantalla tendrá dos opciones, una para elegir en inglés, otra para elegir, disculpe, en español. Y así podrá ver la presentación cuando se comparta en cualquier idioma. Same, you can have access to the presentation in either language. At the top of your screen, you'll have two tabs, one for English, one in Spanish, and you can follow in your language of choice. That's it for language access instructions. Thank you, Sam. Back to you.
Well, thanks so much, Mark. And thank you all for joining. As I mentioned today, these meetings are quite a bit different than the public listening sessions and the formal panel meetings. The purpose of the meeting today is really to give the panelists themselves space to discuss the panel charge questions and start hopefully formulating some recommendations as we move forward. I'm going to go ahead and put up on my screen your agenda for the day. And then I'll hand it back over to staff to relaunch the presentation. So as I mentioned, the goal here is to facilitate the expert panel's deliberations on issues relevant to the panel charge questions. It's really the panel's opportunity to have a discussion with each other. You can see the agenda is very high level here, and in just a few moments, we'll hand it over to the panel chair, Dr. Daniel Geisler, to provide a little bit more detail around these items. But as you can see, really the primary focus is for panel discussion. As with all of these meetings, they are open to the public, and recordings will be posted to the State Water Board's expert panel website following the meeting. But the bulk of the time is set aside for discussion. We do have 20 minutes set aside at the end for public comment. We will stick to those timelines as close to possible as possible. I know all of you have a great deal of interest, but again, really we're here today to give the panelists the opportunity to have a discussion around the charge questions more than anything else. Before we turn it over to the panel chair, I want to go ahead and hand it over to Karen Mogus from the State Water Board for additional opening remarks. Karen.
Yeah, I'm able to unmute, but I'm not able to turn on my video. So I'm just going to start talking and you all can let me know if I can turn on my video at some point. But I'm super excited about the meeting today. I missed the listening session and heard that it went really well and got a lot of good feedback from participants as well as from staff. So hopefully you all found it very useful. Today, we're really focused on getting into the meat of the questions, and I look forward very much to hearing the panel talk amongst yourselves and really deliberate and have a good working meeting. So appreciate your time as always, and excited to hear the conversation. With that in mind, I want to make sure that everyone is reminded that the panel is convened to focus on our charge questions. And so for the panel, you may hear comments that aren't directly related to the charge questions. And so you should use your discretion when considering that input. And for the public, there's limited time available for the panel to deliberate. We have a few meetings. We've so far focused on hearing from the regional boards and from the public, and now we really do need to get down into the work of the panel to really meet the deadlines that we have set forth. So please keep your comments focused and related to the charge questions as best you can. We've also received requests from the panel members and from interested parties to meet to discuss and or follow up on information that was shared during the kickoff meetings and presumably also the listening session. And I just want to remind you all that this convened panel is subject to Bagley-Keene Open Meeting Act, and that means that all of your deliberations need to happen in a public setting. And so if we need to set up separate meetings to talk about specific topics that you're interested in, or make sure that our working meetings include certain topics, we can certainly do that, but just be aware that when a quorum of the panel is convened, it needs to be in a public setting and open to the public and in a noticed meeting. I think that's all I have. I'll let staff add any additional instructions as needed, but really excited to hear the discussion today and look forward to the deliberations and the direction that we hear from the panel. And knowing that we don't have much time, I'm going to stop talking and turn it back to Sam.
So much, Karen. Staff, I've been sending you a few just little chat functions in the private chat you might want to take a look at. So, I'll probably say it several times, but again, this is the panel's opportunity to discuss the charge questions more than anything else. I do want to go ahead and hand it over at this point to the panel chair, Daniel Geisler, for some additional information on today's meeting. Daniel?
Can everybody hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so your point one is the members should briefly introduce themselves. So my name is Daniel Geisler. I'm a cooperative extension specialist in nutrient management at UC Davis.
Wonderful. Thank you for that prompt Daniel. Let's go next to panelist Michael Kahn.
Yeah, hello. Michael Kahn. I'm an irrigation water resources farm advisor with UC Cooperative Extension, and I'm in Salinas.
Thanks, Michael. We'll go next to panelist Richard Smith.
Hi, this is Richard Smith. I am a retired farm advisor, formerly from the Monterey County office, and I worked on vegetable crop issues and nutrient management.
Wonderful. Thanks, Richard. Panelist Oli Montazar.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ali Montazar, Irrigation and Water Management Advisor in Southern California.
Excellent. Thank you. We'll go next to panelist Hannah Waterhouse.
Hi, folks. My name is Hannah Waterhouse. I'm an assistant professor at UC Santa Cruz, and I am a soil biogeochemist by training, focusing mainly on nitrogen cycling.
Wonderful. Thanks, Hannah. We'll go next to panelist Godu Atume.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Godo Atsume. I work with UCANR as a statewide coordinator for our Sigma and Small Farms program.
Thank you so much. Panelist Ruth Dahlquist Willard.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ruth Dahlquist Willard, and I'm the interim director of UC SWRCB. That's the UC Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Program at UCANR.
Thanks, Ruth. And panelist Thomas Harder.
I thought I was unmuted. Hello, everyone. I'm Thomas Harder. I'm a professor of cooperative extension in UCANR at UC Davis. I am a trained hydrologist with a focus on groundwater. And as a hydrogeologist, my focus has been on the interface between, or the nexus between groundwater and agriculture, looking at nitrate issues, but also looking at water supply issues at this nexus between groundwater and agriculture for the last 30 years.
Thanks, Thomas. Okay, and thank you all so much for joining. Daniel, I know that you had some additional information you wanted to share on the agenda. Any other comments from your end before we jump into it?
Well, first of all, thank you, Sam, and the Water Board for organizing this meeting. And thanks everybody on the panel for participating today. So everybody is here. That's really great. So we can have a great discussion. So I was thinking before we really start with the discussion of the charge question, we should get organized a bit. And I prepared a slide with some details. Can you see the slide?
Yes, thank you.
That's kind of a motivational or inspirational slide. We want to go from left to right, get more of the nitrate into the plants, hopefully with the work of the panel. But so for today, I think before we really start discussing the questions, we should probably have a brief look or an opportunity to talk about our general impression of the data that has been presented in the 3 meetings we have attended so far, and whether we think right now we need additional speakers and additional data we should request for our discussion. Then we should also discuss whether we have questions or need clarification on some of the charge questions, or whether they are clear to everybody and we can start the discussion on them. And then just briefly, among the panel members, how do we want to discuss the questions from 1 to 9, or is there another procedure you would prefer? Then another point is, how are we going to write the report? That's something, the content we have to fill into the report. And then whether we have other topics we need to discuss before we really go into details. So I would just like to ask everybody on the panel, what was your impression so far from these 3 meetings we had, where we got a lot of information? And are there speakers you think we should hear from at the next meeting, or for example on the August 31st? Or is there additional data we want to request? If you can think of something right now, then the water board could help us invite these people or prepare data. Hannah?
Thanks, Daniel. Thanks for this, these slides as well. This is super helpful. Always appreciate your organization. Yeah, so from the last hearing or listening meeting, I believe there was a presenter from Eric, whose last name I'm forgetting, from the Soil Health Lab.
Eric Morgan.
Morgan,
Yes.
thank you. Yes,
Mhm.
Eric Morgan discussing what he has seen from the data that he's gathered on the Central Coast region. And I think what he kind of was alluding to was that 50 pounds of nitrogen per acre could be achieved. And so, yeah, I was wondering if, I don't know if it'd be appropriate to be able to, I'm guessing we could not request that data, so there'd be some privacy issues with it, but perhaps just getting a little more granularity on that, or what parameters, what context were those farms existing in that were able to hit that 50 pound.
So kind of a summary or some background information on what he presented.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we can definitely reach out to Eric Morgan and ask him to provide whatever he is comfortable sharing with the panel. Great, thank you. Ali?
Thank you, Daniel. I think, in terms of data and information, we received a lot of good data information. I appreciate from Water Control Board, all the parties, speakers. But I'm going to propose to invite two specific speakers, not with the name, but to area. Because when I put all this information, over the last 3 days, I was just reading and reading and reading. I would like to hear more from two experts on this area. A couple of speakers last meeting and also, I think the first meeting, they talk about the economic part of this, potential interim limit or anything, we want to work on nitrogen and impact on economics. I need to see, these kind of things from one expert, a little bit more detailed, economist with a background in a little bit water quality, nutrient management, a good understanding of productivity and economics of California agriculture. I think, when I'm thinking, we are talking about one of the biggest ag economics in the world. And with the concerns growers they have, from the regulation and those kind of things, always have questions. When I go to Farm Bureau, they have concerns. They ask, what about economics? Do you have any data? What is going on? I think we need an economist to come, and if you have any question about those kind of things and how economics of ag might be impacted by this interim potential limits or any regulatory, if there is any data or prediction, or I think we need to learn from one expert. The second request I have is about, inviting a dairy and cattle person to evaluate for us, how dairy and cattle facilities impact nitrate pollution versus ag in California. If there is any data, I think it's good to have that. I think my request is to invite two speakers, one economist and one, dairy or livestock person to evaluate those compared to ag.
Mm-hmm. Do you have somebody in mind, for example, an economist we could contact or at least ask what they would recommend or who could be a good person to invite? to have a name just as a first person to contact. They may refer us to somebody else, but
I didn't think about that, but I can give you a name, for tomorrow morning because I thought, we should leave it to Water Control Board. That's why I didn't think about, but we can think about, yeah.
Yeah, so we'll see who can come up with names for these two topics. Thank you, Richard.
Hi. Okay, this is great that you're asking this question, Daniel. A couple of things that are on my list. One, Eric Morgan, made the point about the role of nitrous oxide or nitrogen loss from fields, because when we're looking at the A-R model, we do need to understand gaseous loss and the magnitude of that, and how important of a role it is, and do we need to include that factor in the A-R model. And I know in this area, Arlene Hoffa at Cal State Monterey Bay has led a team doing that kind of work. Willie Horwath has done that kind of work, and there may be others. But those are just some names that come to my mind. Also on the R side of the equation, the role of high carbon amendments for immobilizing the pool of nitrate in the fall. This is a practice that was awarded a credit in Ag Order 4.0, and we need to hear what's the latest in terms of the research understanding of those high carbon amendments, how impactful can they be? And a speaker that comes to mind is Joji Muramoto. And then Eric Brennan gave a very nice but very basic talk about cover crops. I think that was good to get everybody, aware of the role that cover crops play or can play in absorbing nitrate from that pool of nitrate that's in the soil in the fall before the onset of the rainy season. Although what we also need to hear is that there's other strategies of cover crops. There's fall cover crops. Mike Kahn on our committee has been working on a strategy looking at winter killed cover crops that remain in the field. But in terms of speakers, I think Mike would be a good speaker. But also Ana Gomes and Sierra Castañeda, the two students that Eric has been working with, have a project looking at evaluating, and Daniel, you also have looked at that. So anyway, I think there's some good people to talk about that. And then just one final thing on the A side of the equation, I think one of the things that's going to be very important as we move forward in reducing kind of the magnitude of nitrate that's in the soil at the end of the season, after the growing season, is through using really pretty robust and nitrogen testing programs during the course of the growing season. This is highly important here in Region 3 and probably in other regions too. But if we can get like Tim Hartz to come and talk about that, he developed that practice. He would be excellent. Eric Morgan talked about it in his presentation the other day, and he has kind of a commercial perspective, so he kind of knows what's what it can be done in from that perspective. So those are just my initial suggestions, Daniel.
Great, thank you. Anna?
Could I just add one more person to the N2O removal side? That'd be Christina Lascano.
Mm-hmm. As far as I know, I think the Air Resources Board recently released a report, at least on nitrous oxide emissions. So it should be possible to find, or the expert who worked on that report, or find somebody from that report. But can definitely check out who worked there. Ruth?
I think one thing that I'd like to add speakers for, it was really interesting to hear from LA and San Diego areas about the challenges with reporting for both small diversified farms and nurseries. And I'd like to request that we bring speakers from the Central Coast who are familiar with challenges there for small and diversified farms, and also from the San Joaquin Valley, where the alternate reporting has been implemented for those types of farms that was outlined in the East San Joaquin order. I also wonder if there's any studies or any information on nitrate leaching in nurseries where plants are mostly in pots and drip irrigated. I think it would be interesting to get a sense of what the potential impacts of that are, and if there's any best practices. I just feel that's not an area I'm as familiar with, and I like to learn more about that. And it seems like a very different system from irrigated agriculture with plants in the ground. So that seems important to consider. And then we did hear, I believe, a public comment from growers in vineyards who already have practices to make sure that the nitrogen content in plants is not too high. That is another area that I think would be interesting to explore further. So those are a lot of additional topics, but I thought I would throw those out there.
Do you have some people in mind we could contact, or shall we just see? Can you think of some people who would be good to reach out to?
For the Central Coast, Aparna Gazula, also Sasha Lozano from I believe the Santa Cruz RCD. There's some folks at Sustainable Conservation as well that I think would be good to invite. And from the San Joaquin Valley, I think some of these people may be on the call. So if you don't want me to volunteer you can let me know later. But I think Deborah Dunn is here. Deborah Dunn and Jarrett Winther have been really involved in the alternate reporting from the Kings River Water Quality Coalition. So it'd be interesting to hear from them how that has gone.
Great. Thank you. Thomas?
Yeah, I want to second all that was requested. I also had some of those on my list, especially those data that Eric Morgan may have, if he has and is able to share data from his presentation. It seemed like the lab data he has would be providing a lot of basic water balance and nitrogen balance data that would be useful specifically on vegetables. To a degree, and I may have talked about this at the first plenary meeting very briefly. To the degree that this panel is charged with deciding between targets versus limits, which is really a policy question to me more than a science question. But still, part of what we're charged with is to figure out whether there's enough data to do one or the other. It would be, I think, important to us, and especially after hearing some of the presentations last week at the last meeting. One, whether the penalty structure, quote unquote, that is sort of implied in this target versus limit discussion is as fixed as it seems to be. You have target, it's soft, coalitions can work with their growers, but maybe nothing gets done. You have limits, fines could be very rough, could put people out of business. Is this how we need to think about this? Or is there actually more flexibility in this in terms of what's associated with targets and what's associated with limits? And is this something that should be part of our discussions? And so having an expert, and I have no names to suggest, having an expert that can talk about this in particular from an administrative law perspective would be great. And I think there was a lot of discussion in this context as well about the enforceability and the potential that the harsher the penalties are, the more people may be forced to cheat, quote unquote. And that's just one way to put it. I think it can be put other ways. But I think from, not that I've ever taken Admin 101 or something like that, but from sort of basic, I guess, policy considerations, in order to make anything that's regulatory, fair and equitable, the penalties need to be tied to enforceability. And so I think hearing from experts on the balance of enforceability versus penalties, and also on the success of using a stick approach versus a incentives approach would be really good to hear.
And my impression is we could find a person talking about this topic from the water board. Is that your impression too?
Could be an attorney as well, right? Or somebody who is really good. And this doesn't have to be somebody in the nitrogen arena necessarily, but certainly in the sort of these distributed resources that are much more difficult to monitor than water that goes through a pipeline.
Okay, great. Thank you. Ruth?
I appreciate that. And I'm also very interested in the carrot versus the stick approach. I wonder also if we could look at other regulatory programs beyond nitrogen and water that have been successful in having large scale adoption and compliance. And I think of other areas like food safety, pesticide safety. I wonder if there's lessons learned in any of those areas that we could draw on as well. I'll have to do some thinking about who to invite for that, but I wonder if there are other regulatory programs, even if they're on different topics, that would have some insights.
Yeah, that would be interesting too. Anything else? Mike? You're still mute.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I agree with everything people are saying. You know, you asked about impressions, and the one impression I had was in a lot of the regions, the A-R, preliminary data is very promising, is in that 50-pound range, but not on the Central Coast, So it does show that we have to think about if there's going to be targets or thresholds or whatever, that this has to be maybe regionally and crop specific. And that's just sort of a general impression. But I think people from outside the Central Coast may not understand that there's this balance. I think that Sarah talked about, Sarah Lopez, of what is economically possible type of threshold that still keeps growers, viable economically, but it may be far off from meeting water quality goals. And so I think, more data on what is the real situation about nitrate contamination in the groundwater. I mean, maybe I didn't see all the data or look at it all, but for all the different areas, I mean, the LA County, they explain there's not much nitrate contamination, and maybe some of these goals and targets have to be really connected to where we have our nitrate issues in the groundwater. So just getting an overview of for all the different areas, basins in California, where are all the hot spots? And probably Thomas Harder would know a lot of that.
I'd be happy to chime in on it.
Sam raised his hand.
Yeah, I hate to jump in. This is a wonderful conversation. I do just want to remind the group that, at the end of the day, we're really focused on the panel charge questions. And I know some of the issues probably seem very inextricable, especially when we start talking about economics. But just a quick reminder to the panel, all of the panelists, that economics was specifically excluded from the charge question. I know how important that is, especially when we start talking about the ability to comply with a potential future regulatory program. But I just wanted to raise that and point it out. The other thing that I'll also mention that I think we've talked about a little bit, that you've all talked about a little bit in meetings before is, because the charge questions for the most part are focused on your technical and scientific expertise, the expectation has always been that the board itself will sort of take your recommendations after you develop them and use them to craft potentially a future regulatory program. So I just want to point that out and again kind of draw you back to the charge questions themselves, but definitely don't want to cut off the conversation. And Karen Mogus, I hate to put you on the spot, but I don't know if you had anything else you wanted to mention there, and no is fine as well. Sorry.
No, I didn't want to add anything. Thanks for those comments. And I agree that it's really hard to extricate the policy from the technical. And so the panel has a hard job to do. And undoubtedly, the conversation will bleed into the policy over the course of the discussion. So we're not fooling ourselves, but at the same time, we definitely want the panel to focus on the technical as much as possible.
Thank you. Thomas, you've raised your hand.
Yeah, and Karen, I appreciate that. And Sam, I think looping us in back to the questions, that's really important. And it's because of this not being able to, or the difficulty to sort of bring the science in, but also be aware of the policy and how they're just so inextricably connected that I'm asking some of these questions. I just wanted to quickly follow up to do a second on Ali's request to have somebody on the economic side to report on what we're looking at. And specifically, I think what I'm looking for is understanding the cost of various practices and how reductions in A-R or in A/R are tied to various costs. I think that would be an important piece to have. And then at the same time, understanding from a legal perspective how California law there is protocol loan, and it requires that groundwater be protected and surface water be protected. And we have the human right to water. And so how is that balanced against the economic interests of the growers and the interest of the broader public in continuing agricultural economy? How does that get balanced? I think that's, at least as background information, important to have.
Thank you. Other comments or suggestions right now? I also think we when we start discussing the questions and we hit the roadblock and we see we need more information, we can always discuss inviting somebody later. So if our list is not complete right now, I think that doesn't mean we can never invite anybody else to present the state or give a presentation. Okay, great. So then I have a quick question for, I don't know, it's Sam, Erica, or Karen. There's a lot of good suggestions. How are we moving forward? I think we have a long meeting on October 31st from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. I think that would probably be a good time to invite speakers to present the data. How are we going to move forward? Shall we meet Sam, representative of the water board, and myself to find some of these speakers, or is the water board, can they do that independently, or what will be the process from now on? We have a really good list of suggestions. Sam, what do you propose, or are you going to do it for us?
Certainly look to actual representatives of the water board and staff. But I know that in the brief conversations that we had, Daniel, we had suggested that these working group meetings might be a really prime opportunity for those sorts of discussions so that you can actually have a dialogue with some of those experts instead of kind of the standard, presentation and then a few minutes for comments afterwards during the larger panel meetings that are obviously pretty packed agendas. So that's certainly one option. But I think, and staff, please cut me off if I'm speaking out of turn here, but I think we're certainly happy to help support lining up those speakers. It might take some follow-up with some of you individually who had kind of broad-ranging suggestions, but it seems like the opportunity to dialogue with folks like Eric Morgan and others that have presented might be hugely beneficial. And staff, I don't know if you had any thoughts, but I know we had kind of discussed that concept previously.
Yeah, no, thank you, Sam, for mentioning that, and agreed that that is one approach. And then, so maybe what we can do is compile the list of, proposed speakers and topics that you guys have just laid out, and then we can maybe go through and see which ones would be best as just a presentation, and see if a speaker is available on the 31st. So we could definitely try to use both types of venues to provide this additional information and access to these expertise for you all. And I think we'll work directly with you, Daniel, once we compile this list. We'll work with you to see how, what makes the most sense once it's all organized.
Mm-hmm. Great, sounds good. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, so then I think our next point would be the panel question, or the charge questions. Do we request any clarification, or is it all totally clear what the question is we should answer? Ali, you just raised your hand. So that would be something then the water board probably at our next meeting on October 22 could clarify whatever comes up right now.
Well,
Ali?
just question 5 is not clear to me, which is question 5 actually.
Yes, that's question 5, because that was my question too.
Okay.
So please go ahead.
Yeah, that was, what is the question, 5 and some, because in some of these documents, they jumped actually question 5. That's why I confused.
Yeah, me too. So I think it would be great if a representative of the water board could clearly define what these additional aspects are and what these summary tables are they are referring to. I have somewhat of an idea, but I think it would be good to have a clear definition so that when we get to question 5, that we all talk about the same thing. The other questions that are not clear or need some clarification? Okay, great. So then just briefly, we have questions 1 through 9. Once we're ready to discuss them, shall we just go from 1 to 9, or does somebody have a better idea of how we are going to tackle these questions? Or shall we just start at the beginning and go through them the way they are written or numbered? Ali?
Well, I think, we have 9 questions, perhaps 5, 6 group meetings. I think, if we categorize, perhaps we can go more in detail, categorize, a specific question for a specific meeting, group meeting. For example, next meeting, just question 1 or 2 or some. I think we can weight them because some of them, they are, we need more discussion perhaps. Some of them, maybe we can just integrate them in 3 in 1 meeting. We can work on that, I think. Just weight them, we can categorize. In addition of that point, I have another point, I would like to make. About question 9, I think that question is very interesting question, and at least I have a lot of thought on that. Because we heard a lot from all speakers about the differences and variations of the different regions. And we see some of them in South California. I'm proposing if we can have a subgroup of us work on expanding potential exemption and bring some thought to group to discuss for the question 9. That was my proposal. If we can create a subgroup to just think about expanding potential exemption and bring to the group.
As far as I understand the process, it would have been part of one of the meetings that have been planned already, because we cannot meet besides the public meetings, but we can definitely dedicate one of these planned meetings to question 9, and those who want and can contribute can join. Others who are not that interested or don't have much to add would not need to join. But it's also, I second your thought, and that's the last point on this slide. I think at every meeting, we should probably discuss what is the goal for the next meeting, which questions do we want to discuss at our next meeting, so that we can all prepare and get ready to discuss these questions. I think that's my goal at the end of each meeting, or at the end of our discussion, briefly say, okay, what are we going to discuss next time? That way we can prepare much easier than when it's just open and we don't know exactly what's going to be discussed. So would that meet your expectation, Ali? Would that work?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, you understand.
Okay, great. But so then, yeah, I think we will go from 1 to 9 in that order, and if something comes up, then we can always make or always adjust. Thomas?
Yeah, on that question 9, and looping back to your earlier question about what additional data might be needed, another piece I think that would be that could be done in a presentation from somebody who is familiar with the regulations, sort of the discussion of public interest of growers, of the industry, and how to weigh all this, how to weigh clean water versus effective and productive agriculture, would be the question of what are the regulations around exemptions that we need to consider when we look at exemptions, not in terms of the specifics, but in terms of the philosophy behind exemptions. What is sort of the general framework under which the boards consider exemptions for individuals or groups of regulated communities? What is sort of the measuring stick that we need to use in considering question 9? And as an example, to to kind of be a little bit more concrete. Right now, the Rice Coalition works very differently from the other coalitions because they were able to show that the impact on groundwater nitrate in rice growing regions is very different from the impact in other regions. And so they fundamentally operate differently. Other regions are implementing, as we heard, irrigated lands regulatory programs, including some regions that include extensive areas of rangelands or irrigated pasture or alfalfa growing regions that from what I know, I don't really associate it with nitrate contamination of groundwater, and where I'm wondering why do we do irrigated lands regulatory programs in these regions, and why are they not exempt similar to others? And so it would be good to hear sort of the framework within which these exemptions are made, what is required to get an exemption, what scientific or technical data are required. I think that will help us weigh in on question 9 in a more informed way.
Thank you. Hannah, you have a comment on that?
This is just a small comment that I was thinking about in relation to having someone come and present on economics. And we've talked a lot about sort of the farm side, but also just the economic impact of contaminated water, I think would be good to have, especially in terms of considering exemptions, etc. I think it'd be just nice to have that point of view represented as well.
Thank you. Ruth?
I agree about all the comments about question 9, and I think it's also good to look at the language about alternate reporting, because it says exemption or alternate reporting, and I think those are both options that may be appropriate depending on different cases. I think, one thing we've seen from the presentations is just the incredible diversity of agriculture in California and how different regions have different systems and crops and industries, that I think a one-size-fits-all program is probably not technically or socially or economically the best fit. And so I think, I'm very interested also in learning more about the criteria for exemptions, but also what are alternate ways of reporting that might fit those systems better.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Anything else right now? So then the next thing I would like to discuss briefly is how we are going to write the report. So we are expected to release a final report at the end. And so the way we collaborate is somewhat limited by the Bagley-Keeney Open Meeting Act. So we're not allowed to meet as a group of 3 or more and hatch out some of the language and then present it at the meeting. So my suggestion would be that Erika and her team from the Water Board take notes during our discussions, write down the most important things and send the notes to us. I would prefer that that would be done by Erika or Sam, whoever, but not by somebody on the panel, because when you have to take notes, it's harder to contribute to the discussions. I would really appreciate if somebody not on the expert panel could take notes so that we remember afterwards what we discussed. And then I would suggest that at the end of each discussion that we briefly define, okay, let's split up our discussion into some sections, and then either teams of 2 or one person alone will work on a section, and then on a draft, better said, send it to the Water Board, and the Water Board staff can compile everything, and at the next meeting, we then can discuss the draft and make adjustments during the meeting. But I think it would be much more efficient if somebody could work on a draft than writing the draft at our meeting when everybody is present. I think that would just take a long time. So that would be my suggestion. And Erika mentioned today, she checked with the lawyers at the water board. If we form teams of 2, then these 2 people would have to work together throughout. So we are not allowed to, let's say, Thomas and I work on section 1, and then a few weeks later, Ali and I work on a different section. So that, according to the lawyers, we cannot do that. So that means probably most of the time, one of us will write a draft for a section, and then we will discuss that at the next meeting and improve on it. So it doesn't need to be the final version we are working on. But would that be okay for everybody, that we distribute the work a bit, and whoever feels strongly or has a good background on a section or a question will provide a first draft? Mike?
This seems like a pretty good plan. Are you going to just ask for volunteers for different sections?
Yeah, so probably while we discuss the section, some of us may contribute more to it than others. So whoever contributes a lot, that would be the person who has probably it would be easiest for that person to write that section. But yeah, I hope we will have plenty of volunteers each time. Sam?
Staff and Erica, sorry to put you on the spot, but I know that you've discussed this concept of sort of the teams of 2. I don't know if there's anything else that you wanted to share about it, just so that folks kind of have a sense of what they might be getting into.
What do you mean?
I'm sorry, that sounded very cryptic, and it wasn't intended to. There's just, as you know, Bagley Keene has some specific restrictions. And I just want to make sure that we're doing everything in accordance with the act. And Erica, I don't know, or anybody at the State Water Board, I don't know if you had more information on that.
Yeah, I think the only additional guiding points that we received that we could add to the discussion was that, if the panel wanted to mix and match pairings with regard to the questions, you could in fact do that, but we would need to take a careful look at the questions to avoid potential for overlap. Some of the questions overlap with each other, and so it would we couldn't have a group of 2 discuss this question and then have somebody from that group go to another group and discuss one of the questions that has overlap with that, because that could create a meeting in series. And so we just want to be very careful of that. And if the panel chose to pair up in that way, to work together offline on actual questions, we would just ask for the opportunity to kind of evaluate the pairings and look at the potential for overlap and help provide any input to that process if you chose to go that route. But yeah, it's certainly simpler if the pairs are kept consistent and many, in all the different aspects of answering the questions and drafting the report. Hopefully that helps.
Mm-hmm. And one more thing after that, Thomas. I think you mentioned that you will provide an outline, so we can send the drafts to you. You would compile everything and then send it out to us before the next meeting, or a link to a Google Doc. Is that does that work for you, Erika?
Yeah.
Or you and your team?
Our team is prepared to provide that support if that's what the panel is looking for.
Yeah. And what will be your preferred way? Send us the draft as a document or have a Google Doc where we can actually add suggestions before the next meeting? Or would that even be legal for us to add suggestions before a meeting and then discuss all these suggestions in a public meeting?
I may need our legal counsel, Eric Gilman, if he's on, to chime in. But I think maybe what we could do is just double check what platform. We do have our FTP site that has many of the panel documents available. And so that could be a great place to, provide the draft. But I'm not sure how it works if you guys were to get in and actually work on it, without it being part of it, I don't know if you guys could all work in the same document. I don't think you can work in the same document in parallel. It would only be that you could work on it together at these meetings, but maybe it's okay for you to review the draft materials ahead of time. So I'll just double check and then get back to you so that at the next meeting, you guys will have that information and that sense of clarity when it comes to the drafting process.
Yeah, so we wouldn't make changes to the document, but if there's an option to add a comment instead of waiting until the meeting, we could add a comment or a suggestion on how to change it. And that in a Google Doc that usually appears with the name of the author, so that would still be everybody at the next meeting, attending next meeting would see that. So if that's an option, that could be one way to do it. But yes, we'll wait until you have an answer on that.
Yes, perfect. Thank you for your patience.
Thomas?
Yeah, I was just going to ask Erica for clarification. So I understand that, if Daniel and I gang up for question number 1, just hypothetical, he can't gang up with Richard for question number 2, and then gang up with Ali for question number 3 or something like that, because then you have this serial thing that can't happen. But I also heard you say, and just correct me if I heard this wrong, if the questions are related, then the related questions would have to be answered by the same team. You can't have me and Daniel answer question 1, and then Richard and Ngodu answer question 2, because they're both about the limits. They're just 2 different aspects of the limits, and they're considered to be too tightly coordinated to have 2 separate teams working on them. Or did I understand you correctly, or is that not what you meant?
I believe that it is okay for 2 as long as the pairs remain the same.
Yeah.
And one pair could work on something that's the same thing as, say that's pair A.
Yeah.
And you have pair B, and they might work on something related. They actually can do that.
Okay.
But you can't swap A1 with B1 and have those 2 work together on another question.
Yeah. That's good to know, because all these questions are of course related, and it would be really hard to say, well, which ones are not related enough to not have that. Okay, this is great. That makes it a little bit easier.
And I did get clarification that we would not be allowed to have a shared Google Doc, but we can provide a draft that you all would be allowed to see. You wouldn't be able to comment or have any kind of interaction inside the document, but you could all see it before the next meeting and then come to that meeting with, kind of the familiarity with the draft as it stands.
Yeah. Okay, that's good. That's just one more clarification. Let's say Thomas and I, between meeting 1 and 2, Thomas and I work on question 1, and then we discuss the draft at meeting 2, and then after meeting 3, would I be allowed to work with Richard on question 5? Because we've already discussed and revised the draft. So if it's split temporarily, would that be possible to switch or mix up teams, or even then not?
I'm going to go off of our experience here. And once looking at our board members, for example, once they're paired on a topic, they are paired on that topic until that topic is complete. And so I believe you cannot switch even though you had resolved and kind of came to a conclusion on one. If it was a related topic and you switched up your pairs, you could potentially create a meeting in series.
Okay, just wanted to check.
That's
So
good.
yeah.
Just guys keep asking as many questions as you want. I don't have all the answers, but we certainly can take notes and come back with more clarification if needed.
But yeah, I think once we get to the point where we will figure out what is most efficient to how to work on that on the report.
Okay.
So, are there other things panel members think we should discuss right now before we get into the questions? Oh, Thomas?
Yeah, I was just gonna, for further clarification from Erica. So that by extension, then that also means if I'm gonna run into Daniel in the hallway and we start talking about question 1 or something related to question 1, and then I see Richard at a conference A in a month, I can talk with him about question 3 or something related to question 3 or question 4, and then I see Ali at yet another conference in 2 months, and we start talking about things. If they're related in any ways to one of the questions, I need to cut this off.
Yes, I believe that is true.
Okay, just to be really clear. Cool, thank you.
Thank you.
Anna?
Sorry, I just had a question about like minority opinions, or like how are, I remember at the very beginning of this conversation, or maybe it was in a letter, that we talked about sort of dissent versus majority opinion versus being able to write a minority opinion. I'm just wondering at what stage that happens, or if we're pairing off and doing this and then.
I mean, so we would pair off, but still we would discuss the content to each question as a team. And I think we will see if we all agree, then we can present it as the opinion of the expert panel. If we don't agree, I think it would be fine or would be appropriate to present different ideas and mention that the expert panel members had different approach or saw different solutions for that problem. And then we can write the different opinions, and we don't have to say the expert panel recommends A or B. We give that selection. I think that would be, in my opinion, the best approach, so that everybody feels comfortable. In the end, we all need to feel comfortable with the report. Our name is on it, and we don't want it to be on the document we really totally disagree. Mike?
Thank you.
I was wondering if there's a question that more than 2 people want to try writing. Can you have 2 teams of 2 people or 3 teams of 2 people, and then look at the different versions, and we can all discuss it? I don't know. It just some of these things, like the limits, might be something that everyone wants to participate in.
I think that would be fine. And then we have 3 or 4 versions, and at our next meeting we can discuss, can we combine them? Or again, back to Hannah's question, can't we agree on one solution, so we keep them separate and present them as potential solutions that may work in some regions but not in others? In my opinion, that should work. Thomas?
My proposal would be that, in fact, we identify these double teams right now for all the questions, because we're going to have plenty to talk about on all the questions. And the sooner we can do that on a team basis, we're, I think, 8 people, so we can split into 4 groups of 2. We have 9 questions, so each team tackles 2 of these questions. We're almost there. But it would be the same team for the 2 questions. So if we have team with A1 and member A1 and member A2, that team A would tackle 2 questions.
Mm-hmm.
And there might be
But
one
do other
team
things,
that
shall we do that
does
right
3,
now,
so
or?
that would be my suggestion.
Mm-hmm. We could do it right now, or wait until we see who has most contribution. I'm open to both solutions. What do the other members think? Shall we form teams right now and then stick to that? Richard? You're mute.
Sorry, I don't know. I mean, this whole thing is a little, we're dancing around a really interesting set of criteria, but if we do decide, which items that we want to, or which of the questions that we want to discuss, I mean, I would think that I have kind of a strong opinion about what I know most about, which is later, like I think it's like number 7 or something like that. So maybe that does make sense. I guess I would weigh in and support what Thomas just said.
Mm-hmm. Thomas?
And maybe one way to go on this is to just do a quick straw man poll from everybody, which 2 questions 2 or 3 questions or 4 questions, or which of the questions actually without a limit, they be comfortable to be a team on, or most interested to be working with. And maybe something's gonna, out of that straw poll, some natural grouping will occur if we're lucky.
Erika has a comment.
Hi, it's actually Adelia. So I have a follow-up question.
Sorry, I can see you very well.
For clarification on the process on how you were thinking that this could work. And I was wondering if basically the follow-up report writing would be based on the discussion that everybody is participating in the working group meeting. And so the pair is really just, is your intent that the pair is there to follow up from the notes that are provided from that meeting that everybody is participating in who's interested in participating?
Correct, yes. So somebody needs to put it in writing what we discuss at the meeting. Okay. That was the idea.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mike, does that answer your question, or do you have a comment?
I was just going to request maybe wait till next time. As we begin to discuss the first question, that might be a good time to ask which questions we want to work on, just to give us a little more time to really think deeply about that.
Mm-hmm. Thomas, would that be acceptable? That we wait until next time and then we form the teams?
Yeah, that makes
then
total sense to me.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that sounds good. Are there other things we need to discuss before we dive into discussion of these questions? Okay, otherwise, I mean, the question, are we ready to start with question 1, discussion with question 1? Does everybody feel prepared to tackle that question today, or start tackling the question today? Okay, well then, great. Let's get started. So here you all have it in front of you. So that's the panel question 1 and 2. I'm not going to read it. Gudu?
Sorry, did you say we should pause to read it? I was ready to chime in. I do have some comments, so maybe if we're starting to discuss on that question 1.
Okay, yes, please.
It's raining, so hopefully you can hear me.
Mhm.
So for the first part of the question, I think just going through it on my own, and then now that we're having a discussion, and all the presentations they've given, it sounds like, and the data, they've given us a lot of data. I would say there's sufficient data for at least a few of the regions to be able to have those related groundwater limits, crop-specific limits. And then just thinking of the protective groundwater quality, I think we have the human rights water. We do have 10 milligrams per liter, thinking of communities and drinking water standards to meet. So we sort of have a benchmark. It was very interesting seeing the data from the Central Coast, just going through how much they've collected in that region, as well as in the San Joaquin Valley. My first thought about this question was it can't be one size fits all, because it sounds like other regions haven't collected enough data, but then there are other regions that have collected a lot of data. And just going back to your earlier question about maybe what sort of data do we want? Or are we thinking of a request? Thinking about this question, I was very interested in, is it possible for us to get maybe the list of the top crops in all these regions and how much nitrogen they utilize? And I was also thinking about irrigation water, how much nitrogen is there or needed for each of these crops, and how do we get to that protective standard? I think for those that already have data and have been collecting, it's possible to have that crop-specific nitrogen limit if we do know how much each crop is discharging and how much is being applied. For the other regions, it sounded like some regions haven't collected this data at all. I think it'll be more difficult to set that in there. But yeah, those were like my initial points, thoughts for up onto the question mark, because this question is sort of divided into 4 parts. Yeah, that was sort of my feedback.
Thank you. So I'm a bit more skeptical whether we have enough data, especially for crop specific limits, or just actually when I looked at this question, I didn't really like to be limited to limits. So I mean it could be targets as well. So when I thought about this question, it was mainly about or I thought as thresholds. Do we have enough data? And probably for the major crop, we have some data, but I mean, to really have crop-specific thresholds, we would need to consider total nitrogen uptake of the crops and nitrogen from other sources. I think A-R is a good tool for regulatory purposes, but it doesn't really help growers manage their crops. And if we really want to motivate growers to manage their crops the best way possible, we would need data on the total nitrogen uptake of that crop, but also data on residual nitrate, although that can be measured. Ideally, nitrogen mineralized from soil organic matter would also factor in. So if we want to go to strict limits on a crop-specific basis, yeah, I agree. We probably have it for some major crops, but not for all of them. And when I think of how challenging it was just to get nitrogen removal data for the major crop in the Central Valley, and Richard did it for the Central Coast, and we both spent several years on that data. So I think it would probably take a while to get the data. For crop-specific limits we are comfortable with, or let's say that I would think of limits, let's say 75 pounds per acre or whatever. I don't know, what do others think? Do we have the data for most of the crops to go that way, to define it for each crop, Ruth?
So I agree with Godo that this is really 4 questions. And I think we don't have the data for every crop for sure. I can speak from personal experience. I had a FREP grant with Aparna Gazula where we had 5 crops among the diversity of specialty vegetables that are grown on Chinese immigrant farms and Southeast Asian refugee farms in California. And there can be, I don't know the number off the top of my head, but I'm going to guess like 50 to 80 crops on those farms that there's no data for California. So we got it for 5 with a grant. That's like 10 more grants to get all the data for all of those crops. And there's, I think, diminishing returns on that. I think for diversified farms like that, it maybe make more sense to have a whole farm approach, but that also would need some more research. And so I think maybe we can consider what crops do we have more data for and what are the gaps in crops that we don't have data for or farming systems we don't have data for. And I think the 4th question is sort of the easiest to answer. What additional data do we need? I think even just quantifying which crops is there enough information for and which need more information, but also where are there already limits because of the farming system that's being employed? For example, vineyards that are testing for nitrogen because of quality, or I think also organic farms that are limited in how much compost they can apply with their organic certification, that they can't go over a certain amount and be organic certified. I think it's also interesting to look, and maybe that relates to questions 8 and 9 too, but what limits are already in place, I think would be a good question to ask.
Ali?
Well, I think, we already heard from several speakers, entities about, the removal part of that A minus R or the ratio A to R. I think that R and crop coefficients still, we don't have them, diversified and a small cropping system, nursery, we don't have in South. And, it means we don't have that information. But I think the other question will be, I think, something different. We don't have it here. Even if you say we have the crop coefficient for majority crops, if you look at, for example, for desert. So if we develop all the crop coefficient we have 110 crops in Imperial Valley. So about 85% of the cultivated area goes just to 18 crops. It means about 82 crops are just 10%, 12%. So what about those? If we want to really develop those crop coefficient, it will take maybe 15 years from now for the desert region. Of course, for the other region, the same, I think we need to think about that. So if we say today we don't have enough data, perhaps we should think about maybe we don't have it in the next 10 years too. If you want to go with 95% of the cultivated area crop coefficient and R values, we don't have it probably. I think we need to think for that gap too, I think this is the question I always had for myself. I would like to share with you. It will be feasible, for example, we develop, for the majority of the crops, the cropping system in each region, maybe, 85% something of the crop cultivated, in the region. And then think about the other crops, go with the similarity, because, that 10% crops in the desert, even if we have the nitrogen, crop coefficient, it doesn't impact that much, the region, because 85% of the removal comes from the other major crops. I think we want to wait for them and say we don't have the data or we want to develop them. Maybe we should go with some similarity, say, okay, if we have crop coefficient, this crop coefficient, can we consider this crop coefficient for the other similar crops. I think maybe one solution, we should think about one solution. Otherwise, this is not a gap. We can refill it today, you know? And I think we should talk about that too.
Thank you. I was also thinking probably we should think about a long-term approach and a short-term approach. A long-term approach would really be to get all the data to have confident limits for the crops, but that's going to take a long time. On the other hand, we know we can't wait just 10 years and not do anything, because the water quality is not going to improve. And if we have a solution in 10 years, the growers who produce then will even have a harder time to meet the limits or targets. So I was thinking about a different approach. And so I was just thinking, I looked at this, or we heard from a lot of people, especially grower representatives, it should be crop specific. And that's also the question one. So I was thinking, if we look at the specific field and we see that 80% of the growers in the same region have a lower A-R producing the same crop, let's say silage corn in the Sacramento Valley. If 80% do a better job, have a lower A-R value, I think we could definitely, it's fair to say that the growers, the top 20%, they can do a better job or should do a better job. So what about if we set the thresholds that way? If we say, okay, it could be 20/80, 30/70, or wherever it is. But if we set a threshold and say, okay, whoever is above should be motivated, or there should be incentives, whatever that would be, to improve nitrogen use efficiency on these crops. So then that would not require additional data. We have that already. We just arrange all the farms or all the fields in a specific region growing the same crop from lowest to highest, sets that threshold and say, okay, who's those above, they need to do a better job. And the water board and coalitions together need to come up with some solutions or incentives that are strong enough that these growers really feel like they need to improve. And what that would do, basically, if they improve, if the incentives are good enough, then that threshold would decrease over time, because many of these growers hopefully would fall below the threshold. So next year or 2 years later, the threshold would be lower. So over time, that threshold decreases. So that would be one suggestion I would, or one solution I was thinking of as a short-term solution that wouldn't require additional data. Mike?
So I guess I thought this would happen is, as you discuss the question, you have more questions. And so one question is, because it's worded here as crop-specific nitrogen-related limits. And if you looked at Ag Order 4.0, the way it's set up, the A-R is not crop-specific, right? There is in question, is it 6? That one is about A-FERT, and that is specific in Ag Order 4.0 for specific crops, and saying you can't apply more than this much fertilizer for, a lettuce crop or a broccoli crop. The first question, the wording is crop specific, but in our region, we usually have double crop, triple crops. So how could you ever set a limit? You just can't do that, because the nitrogen that would come from the mineralization of the residue of the first crop would be available for the next crop, right? And depending on what order the crops are, that's going to affect the nitrogen needs. So I don't see how you can set anything that's crop specific. You could set it by a land acre, and that's how the Ag Order 4.0 already is.
So would you think for the Central Coast it would be better just have a 12-month period to look at A minus R, for example, and independent of what crops are grown, or what would be an alternative of crop specific on the Central Coast that would work better?
Yeah, right now the ag order is a 12-month period.
You think
And
that would be a better approach based on your personal opinion?
well, you can ask Richard too, because he's on the Central Coast too. But it's just, how do you say, okay, lettuce, you only can put on 120 pounds. And maybe in the first crop, we don't have much nitrogen to start off the year because of all the rain. You need 170 pounds. But then on the second crop, we might grow broccoli, and maybe typically broccoli you put 200 pounds on, but there's enough nitrogen in the soil from the first crop mineralization that you only need 150 pounds or 160 pounds, on. And so that you have to look at it all in aggregate over the whole season. And that seems to be how they designed the Ag Order 4.0. So the wording here in question 1 seems to work in areas where you have one crop a year.
Mm-hmm. Good point. Ruth, you raised your hands first, and then Richard and Hannah.
I think some of the feedback we heard from the presentations was that there's cases where a 12-month period doesn't work because you might apply nitrogen and then remove it in one crop. Then you have a second crop, you apply and remove. Then you have a third crop, you apply nitrogen. But let's say that you're now harvesting it in January, February of the year after all of that happened. Now your A minus R or A over R is going to be off because it doesn't include the R from your harvest of your last crop that was in the last few months of that calendar year, like November, December. Does anybody have, like Richard or Michael in particular, do you have any thoughts about the best setup for that kind of situation that would make sense for the cropping cycle and allow the accurate calculation of A and R? And you can come back to this later if other people have more comments in the meantime.
You want to go?
Well, Michael, that is, I don't know the specifics of how that's dealt with, but that has been addressed or been discussed, and maybe Sarah Lopez has I don't know if Sarah's on this call, but they had a way of dealing with that for this area, because that what you just laid out is very common here.
I think also because it's reported often on the ranch level, right? So you have lots of crops all the time getting planted and harvested. And so what you didn't take into account for R of this year, it's going to be in your following year. And also the thought is you look at a moving average over several years, and evaluating how a grower did. So I think there's always enough because you're doing it over multiple years. There will be R carryover to the next year, but then that next year there's going to be more R carryover for the following year. So it sort of all works out. You just have to have a boundary somewhere, and the thought was to just choose the calendar year.
I think that's all. Just as a side note, that's also an important difference in the Central Valley. It's on a per field basis, and on the Central Coast on the per ranch basis. So that's also quite a different approach between the regions. Richard?
Yeah, I think Mike kind of said a lot of what I was thinking. But the issue in these double cropped or even triple cropped systems is it's not so easy to just do a simple analysis. Okay, this crop you put on this amount, and that's all that it should get, because and this is one of the things that I'm going to be, very much advocating through this whole process, is the need for, the in-season practices of, nitrogen testing. And then that really guides your fertilizer application. And in some cases, it may be that you put on less than the crop takes up because of the residual nitrogen that's there from, any of the number of sources that can come from. And in our area, crop residues is huge, but then organic matter and so forth. And then the fate of the, because a crop like lettuce, let's say you only harvest 40% of the crop. And so you leave this huge amount of residue behind, and but it can be accounted for in the subsequent crop. So like Mike said, a crop like broccoli typically is scavenging nitrogen, so growers are typically putting on less than it ever takes up. And that was very surprising that we, to see that here, but it's kind of uncanny that it happens quite routinely. And then at the end of the season, though, this is where the nitrogen testing again plays a huge role of not loading up the soil at the end of the, so that the end of the season you come in with reasonable amounts of nitrogen. And then if you use a cover crop or high carbon amendment, these kinds of practices can really have an impact on the amount of loss that you get during the winter, because the winter is the uncontrolled season for nitrogen management. It's basically, it depends on the weather and the soil type and so forth. So anyway, long-winded discussion, but I just think these, we have to kind of think of things from a more comprehensive integrated perspective.
Thank you. Just a second, Ali. Hannah, you had raised your hand. Do you still have a comment, or has that already been made?
It was already addressed by Ruth. I was wondering about that carryover.
Okay, great. Thank you. And Ali?
Thank you, Daniel. Good discussion. Let me just talk about desert, because you see obviously some differences here about this story. And some of the things are happening in the future, and we decide today, if we had this discussion 3 years ago, I didn't say this, but now I should say it, because it happened just this year and is happening. Well, the story in the desert is different. Growers, they have vegetables, and then they were smart. Just immediately after the vegetable harvest, they planted another crop, just like Sudan grass as a hay, or cantaloupe, or a summer crop. Now, the irrigation district, because of the water situation of Colorado River, they encourage them to plant anything. When they do that, plant anything, this is, it comes from our data the last 2 years. So the fallow field, because growers in the desert, they need to do summer leaching, sometimes late August, early September, to maintain the salinity. It's part of the, ag system here. They don't live without leaching. So what happens? We have a heat, extreme heat. We have the fallow, low organic matter, extensive mineralization from the previous crop. And after that leaching, the grower just lost two-thirds of the nitrate comes from the previous crops. So basically, there is no contribution, and that comes from the nature. And the real practice growers, they do it, and they have to do it. I think, as Richard mentioned, so please consider those kind of things. We need to look at the bigger picture here. Different region, different practices, different natures, and all those, yeah. So we don't see that much contribution from the previous crop in the desert. It's not like your region.
So if the goal were to reduce nitrate leaching, or the goal is to reduce nitrate leaching in the desert, what would be an appropriate approach to motivate or incentivize growers to do that? Are there possibilities, or are you just saying no, there's no way they can avoid leaching most of it during the summer?
We work on cover crop. We found some good result on salinity, on keeping the nitrogen available for the next crop, those kind of things. But it takes a while because those practices are not common at this moment. Maybe, yeah, in the future.
Guru?
Thank you, Daniel. I have a question for the regions that don't have, or for the areas that is not mostly multiple crops, like where there's monocropping. Also, this is not my area of expertise. I've mostly worked with communities that have drinking water impacts from nitrates. I'm curious for the regions that have just one crop being grown, where it's not lettuce and then something else. Do we know which of those crops, monocropping, have crops coefficients that have already been established already? For any of those crops, has anyone on the panel worked on it? Or is there a list that maybe the board can share with us for regions where we have, hundreds and hundreds of acres of just one crop year in, year out, what that looks like? And I think for regions like that, it might be different from what Michael and others on the coast are describing when it comes to having crop-specific limits.
You mentioned coefficient. What did you mean with coefficient?
Well, just understanding, the crop coefficient, understanding like the soil type in those regions, understanding the crop-specific nitrogen used. If it's just one crop, if it's not different crops in that region, if it's just one crop, say almonds, right? What does that look like? And I'm just also echoing the interest in having someone talk to us on soil that was shared earlier.
So I can probably answer some of that question for the Central Valley. So here, usually one crop is grown during the year. Cover cropping is not that popular, mainly because of water. And so that data has been collected. Eric gave a presentation since 2018. We do have access in our folder to the Excel files from each coalition. There are thousands. They collect the data from each field individually or each management unit. So that data is available and we have it in our folders, and the water board also, the coalitions actually, they prepare a summary each year. So there is pretty detailed information on nitrogen applied and nitrogen removed for many of the crops. And in order to calculate nitrogen removed, the growers report yield, and then it's converted to pounds per acre using a coefficient. That's why I ask you what you mean with coefficient. So that word is often used. And so in the Central Valley, my lab has worked on these coefficients, and I think we now have for about 90% of the crops. Well, we first did a literature review for 90% of the crops, but in the meantime, we have collected hundreds, probably thousands of samples and analyzed them to get better data specific to the Central Valley. And on the Central Coast, Richard Smith has done a lot of work with the vegetables grown there and developed these coefficients so that the yield reported by growers can be converted to nitrogen removed. So that's for Central Valley. I think data since 2018 or 19 is available. Central Coast, not sure the detailed data. Other regions, much less. And I know Ali can talk about the desert, if that data has already been collected or published, or if it has just started.
Hey, Daniel, on the Central Coast, so our project was to try and capture coefficients for 95% of the crops or crops that are consist of 95% of the area.
Mm-hmm.
That's an area. So it's not all of the crops, but it's a sizable number.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Does that answer your question, Guru? Or
It does. It does. I think I was trying to highlight the difference where there's other regions there's monocropping, it's just one crop being grown year in, year out. And just back to question one, but yeah, that answers the question. Thank you.
But yeah, I think probably the Central Valley is the best region to look at when you want to see systems where only one crop is grown. That's the most common system here. Thomas, you raised your hand.
Yeah, I wanted to sort of chime in and come from a slightly different angle and support this entire discussion, which I think is super, super important, but bringing in an additional angle and maybe as a straw man hypothesis, say on this question, and specifically, and I think specifically on the question, not of crop specific limits, but limits in general on the landscape. We know what limits need to be enforced to get good water quality. And I thought if I can share, I'll share a slide that many of you probably have seen me show before. Let's see, do you see the
nitrate from the water table to a well?
Yes, exactly. Okay, so this is sort of my view of the world, my hydrogeology biased view of the world. I'm not on top of the landscape. I'm in a lot of our work, we're below the landscape, being groundwater people. And so the landscape is above us, and what we're operating in is this groundwater system. And in this groundwater system, wells are like pipes. They look like pipes hanging from the ceiling, where the ceiling is the landscape. And somewhere along that pipe, they're screened. Those are these lighter green areas. Do you see my cursor? Does my cursor show up on your screen?
If you right click, you could probably select
no, it
pointer.
doesn't. Let me see. Oh, you know what? I'm not in presentation mode. That's why. Then it'll pop to another screen. But these lighter screen shaded areas on top of these long pipes that are hanging down from the ceiling here, this is where water goes into the well. This is where the pipes are slotted, or we call them well screens. That's where the water goes into a well. And in a lot of our basins, the recharge comes from the landscape. It's return flow from irrigation. It's excess precipitation. Some of it might be from streams. This particular example, it's all landscape. There's no stream. And what I'm coloring here is looking at a particular well. Where is the water coming from? And we can sort of track that backwards by understanding the flow, the groundwater flow in that system, all the way to where it was recharged at the water table, just below the landscape, which is the ceiling here. And so this is the area that is sort of captured by the pumping from this well. It changes over time because the well can go off and it can go back on. Groundwater flow can change, but overall, there's sort of a pattern to this. And the other, so you can see that what comes into this well extends over a larger area. For a domestic well, this area can be a few tens of acres, a few hundreds acres. For an irrigation well, it can be hundreds to thousands of acres. It can be a mile away, it can be 10 miles away, it can be really close by, depending how deep that well is and in which direction groundwater flows. So you can see here, the well is over here. The source area is over here. This is probably about 1 square mile. So probably 2 miles away or something in this particular case. The other thing that you can see here that these lines are colored as a function of age. And so looking at the well over here, where the green is actually shaded in black, you have different, along the screen, you have different ages that are coming into the well. In an irrigation well, we can have between the top of the well and the bottom of the well, the age difference can be tens to hundreds of years. In domestic wells, which have a shorter screen that are closer to the surface, we typically find that age range between the shallowest part of the screen receiving water and the deepest part of the screen receiving water can easily be a decade or more. And so what comes out of the well, which we want to have want to be below the 45 milligrams per liter of nitrate or 10 milligrams per liter of nitrate N, is a mixture of water from various locations and a mixture of water that's of various ages. And so what we do know is we want this water that's coming out of the well, which is going to be a mixture of all of this water going in, to be below the drinking water limit of 10 milligrams per liter. Now, in some cases, the nitrate that goes in at the water table is somewhat denitrified along the journey. In other places, there's very little of it. In some places, especially in our rice growing areas, a lot of denitrification happens right up here before it even really gets going in the groundwater, which is why rice is regulated very differently. So that's one thing to consider, and that's something to actually keep in mind. The other part to consider is that what we really want in this well is this mixture to be below the drinking water limit, which means really over the long term and as an average across this well area, and really as an average, doesn't have to be at every location. We want this recharged water to be below 10 milligrams per liter, which translates into 27 pounds per acre foot. So if you have 1 acre foot of recharge on average across this region, you want to have on average less than 27 pounds, plus accounting for any kind of denitrification that might happen below, on this pathway. So from a hydrogeologic perspective, I could argue, I know exactly what we need to do. But I think the question really then is, what does that mean with respect to what happens at the landscape? And I think this is where this crop specific part, I would agree, we probably need to get away from crop specific limits versus something that takes into account the mixing that happens in a well, something that takes into account the travel time, the denitrification. If there's a river in the source area, then that river has very clean water that gets mixed into a well. And so that actually helps ameliorate what happens with, whatever nitrate comes with the landscape. So these are complex issues, but to some degree we can model these. And we do know that 10 milligrams per liter in drinking water equals 27 pounds per acre foot. Those are exactly the same numbers. But then exactly what comes out of the well is a function of age and mixing, et cetera, et cetera. So I just want to bring this out because there's a couple things that it helps us understand that I think need to look at. I don't think we need to look at a particular season or a particular crop, especially when these are crops like in the Central Coast where you have 3 crops in a row. I think looking at one particular crop, as many of you have pointed out, makes no sense because that's just one piece of the puzzle that gets eventually mixed in this well. And looking at a rolling 3-year total nitrogen mass balance at a particular place, whether that's the entire farm or whether that's a field, makes much more sense. And then the other thing I think that makes more sense, rather than looking at really tiny parcels, is I think I would say that we know that if we get an average over a quarter section or a section of land that is over a half-mile by half-mile area or a mile area, which is about the size of many fields in the Central Valley at least, but that would be a farm when it comes to small diversified farmers. or many farms when it comes to small diversified farmers. I think looking at the larger scales is much more important in understanding what happens and controlling what happens at that square mile and larger scale is much more important than looking at what happens in every little parcel. And I wanted to throw this out because I'm hoping this can shape some of our discussion in terms of how do we get there, and what do we know about agricultural practices? And that's where you are experts. Many of you are experts. What do we know about agricultural practices that will allow us to get us to where this needs to be? And does it really need to be 27 pounds an acre, assuming there is an acre foot of recharge, which is sort of if I had to give an average recharge rate for the entire state of California off the top of my head, I would say it's probably an acre foot per acre per year. And so, is that 27 pounds plus some denitrification credits? Is that where it needs to be? And if it can't be there, why can't it be there? And why can't this be the limit?
Hey, thank you. A lot of questions, but Ruth raised her hand first, and Hannah and Mike too. So Ruth.
I was just going to give a general comment, and then I think maybe others would have more specific responses to what Thomas shared. But I do think it sounds like there are crops and regions where we have a lot more data than others. And so I just want to recommend that we don't consider a one-size-fits-all solution, but maybe we identify what regions do we have enough data for, and we feel more comfortable setting a target. And then other regions, if we don't have enough data, then maybe we need to have a way of, holding off on that until we have more information on how that works.
Thank you. Hannah?
Yeah, I guess I'm echoing Thomas and Ruth here. I do think I'd like to get away from the crop specific language. I think and conducting the A-R at a more of a ranch level. I think I just want to +1 to that. And not having a one size fits all across the regions. I think that makes no sense. Especially given the sort of, when we step back and look at it from like a systems perspective. I think also maybe something to consider is in the Ag Order 4.0, there were incentives for high carbon amendments and cover cropping that was hopefully going to increase adoption. And I know that this potentially, conflicts with concerns growers have about water use for their cash crop, as well as potentially GSAs. And I think just looking at other kind of structural barriers to implementing these R practices that could help facilitate this 50 or 27 pound nitrogen discharge limit. So for example, a lot of the farmers I've worked with, they have pretty tight schedules for turning around their crops and selling it to whatever buyer they have a contract with. And so I don't know how, and I think we also heard from someone who was presenting, I believe, on the last, from the last technical advisory panel on, say there's crop, they've applied their fertilizer, there's crop failure, that A-R gets huge for no fault of their own. I think really having that, I don't know if it's a 3-year average or more, but I think we definitely need to have that rolling average.
Thank you. Mike, you raised your hands too.
Yeah, I thought Thomas made some really good points here that, where we ought to focus is where we have high nitrate wells, right? And also this idea we got to look at the landscape, like how much loading of nitrogen can we have in that area where we're trying to clean up wells. And so I could see the limit sort of being related to what it takes to, to protect the water quality and the future. But we don't necessarily have to tell a grower who's doing vegetables, you have to get down to 50 pounds an acre. We can look at a whole, at a larger scale around them with the mix of crops, right? And say, well, if you could get that 300 down to 200 or 400 down to 300, that would help a lot, at a township level. And so we have to look at everything, all the different crops together. And if, it's all vegetables in one place, at least make some progress here. But I don't want to put growers out of business here. Where I think we also have to use not just looking at, the distribution of what growers can do, because every situation is different depending on where you are in the landscape, but what's scientifically possible, through actual field trials that have been done in the past. If we know they ought to be able to go with a little less nitrogen because they have very high nitrate in their water, they should be doing that. And so we can't put limits on fertilizer, but maybe on the amount of total applied nitrogen in that landscape area related to the wells and what the well data is telling us.
Thank you. So I think in a perfect world, I really like that idea. My question is just, when you have let's say, a township or a certain area that contributes, or where the water contributes to one well, taking the average that protects the quality of the water, that sounds really good. But the problem I see is if there are different growers contribute to the water, then how do you decide who can leach a bit more and who can leach a little bit less? So taking the average, if there's just one grower, taking the average across the entire ranch makes a lot of sense. But if there are 3 or 4 ranches and some of them contribute more than others, how do you decide who is allowed to contribute more to the nitrate and who needs to be below, so that you can reach the average? I think that's one question I'm struggling a bit with. Otherwise, the landscape approach would make a lot of sense to me.
I mean, it raises the question of a market, right? Do you give credits that everybody is allowed X much amount of pollution credits? The average, if you need more, you buy it from somebody who does less. That's in principle what I've seen in at least one place in New Zealand, where they did exactly, well, where they kind of did that. But is that, can we even talk about this on this panel? Is that something we want to put in the report? I don't know. I think that's where some of these experts that can weigh in on economics, that can weigh in on structures of regulatory programs, of incentivized, incentive programs versus when it's carrot versus stick. I think that will help us understand, in the context of the State Water Board and the State Water Board needs and the needs for California, better what path we're going down.
Gudu?
Michael had his hand first, so you can go before me.
Sorry, I missed that.
No, I was just gonna say, I'm not too worried about if you have different growers, because if they're growing the same sort of mix of commodities, right, vegetables, well, they should be held to a similar limit. If they're growing something that is provides less, nitrogen, it doesn't have as much risk of nitrate leaching, they're going to make those limits anyway. So it's really, setting up the limits for the commodities that are probably the most problematic in terms of nitrate leaching. So you could have vineyards, you could have a tree, orchard of tree crops, and you might have some vegetable crops, and maybe you have strawberries, and they're all in the same area. But we know that the vegetables need to get down a little more, right? So you set the limit that everyone else can make, but the vegetables are going to have to work the hardest to make those limits.
Mhm. Guru?
Thank you. I think I have similar thoughts as Michael, just from a community perspective. The drinking water users, people that have, going back to Thomas's map, where there's that level of contamination that has been there for so long, and your drinking water is so contaminated that you can't even drink it and are having to purchase water, right? You're having to pay for water you can't drink. So thinking about that balance, I think Sarah Lopez put it nicely in her last presentation as the gap between, the farmers that sort of have to stay in business and then reaching these communities that have contaminated drinking water in these regions. It seems to me, I'm not from California, like it's such a persistent issue. And there's language in question 1 around protective of groundwater quality. So I'm just thinking back to, I think Ruth said it might need to look different for different regions if we're going to get to this sort of 10 milligram per liter that is protective of water quality. I don't know how much fertilizer each grower is applying, but if we have the benchmark as protective of groundwater quality, then, it might need to be limits in some regions, targets in some regions, and also maybe tiered over a period of time in order to protect drinking water. And then it might also be having a target for regions that have more communities closer to them. But I'm also trying to put this into the conversation around, these communities that have been impacted for several years with contaminated drinking water.
Thank you. Ruth?
I want to kind of go back to a comment that was made earlier. I think, Daniel, did you mention the silage corn as an example?
Yeah.
I think that's an interesting thing to look into. Because I think, Godo's correct that protective of groundwater quality is the main purpose. And so that's why we're all here. I wonder, I'm just thinking about that example you gave, Daniel, about what if there's an example crop where, let's say 80% of the growers of that crop in that region, in that farming system, are pretty close to the desired value of A-R or A over R, whatever's being used. And then there's that 20% that are higher. I feel like there must be areas like that where there's potential to actually work with the growers who are doing things better to find out why is that working for them and could other people adopt that same thing. I think there's a very large value in peer-to-peer sharing of information. And if 80% of people, like I'm hypothetically, right, we haven't looked to see if this is happening, but let's say we have that scenario, that means 80% of growers of that crop in that system in that region are, close to the target. I think that would be interesting to find out more about. And I wonder if there's ways we can look at data to actually identify any situations like that there might be. Do you think that in our data sets we could pull that out, or water quality coalitions could pull something like that out? I could see, like, if we're going with a region specific approach that's not one size fits all, I wonder if we could identify pilot areas for like a pilot program where we could do something like that. Yeah, I just wonder what the potential is for that, because I'm also sensitive to, there's twice in question number 1, it's mentioned support a long-term sustainable irrigated lands regulatory program. And to me, that includes the compliance aspects. And I know we've been told not to discuss economics, but I think that question includes some social science, right? Of like that's from a policy perspective, what's going to keep that program sustainable politically and socially not just, I think, in terms of, the amount of nitrogen in the soil or other factors. So, yeah, that's just, I wonder if there's ways to find cases like that could be looked at as examples.
I did the analysis for silage corn. Hannah, would you mind if I showed that slide before we get to your comment?
Oh, so it wasn't a hypothetical example?
No.
Well, that's nice.
Let me see. So that I just looked at the East San Joaquin Valley Coalition, and that's the silage corn in 2023, A-R, and these are just the field percent and from lowest to highest. So let's just assume all these values are correct. So the lowest values are A-R minus 200, and the highest are 350. So I was wondering, so what if we set that threshold at the 80% level? So I think it would be fair to say, well, these 20%, they can really do a better job and they should be incentivized to do a better job, whether that's more training, more education, or financial incentives. If we can motivate them to do a better job over the years, that red line would come down, because these high values would disappear. So at the moment in 2023, the 80 percentile would be at 58.4 pounds per acre. So doesn't meet the benchmark yet. Thomas laid out the 31 pounds, but it would us get there. So that could be one approach, to look at each crop and say, okay, if you're the top 20, you really need to do a better job, because 80% of your neighbors show us it is possible to do, and it's possible to do in the region. The benchmark would also need to be applied. For example, there are crops like alfalfa. We have vine grape will probably be similar. You have values from minus 700 all the way to 200. And the 80 percentile is at minus 280. And I think it's clear, well, we don't expect alfalfa growers all to reach minus 280. So we will probably have to look at the benchmark and say, well, okay, if you're below that benchmark, let's say it's 31 pounds per acre, you're fine. It doesn't matter whether you're the top 20% or not. But we see with alfalfa, there are growers who are above that, and still assuming that it is the data is correct, there are alfalfa growers with an A-R of 200. So there are definitely a few growers who can do a better job. So that could be one approach, to use the 80 percentile and the benchmark combined to determine who should really improve management. And so then the 80 percentile over the years would come down. Now, Hannah, sorry for interrupting.
Thank you for that, Daniel. I was just going to say, I think Sarah Lopez from the Preservation Inc. did show some data that they've collected, and I think this has kind of been their approach. Correct me if I'm wrong, but where they're looking at those outliers and going and discuss, providing outreach and education. And I guess the only question, and it sounds, I do like that approach. I think just, what if it hits a point when 80% of the growers are, doing the best they can, but it's still not protective of water quality. I think that's kind of where it could get tricky. But I think having Sarah maybe come and talk more about that, because my understanding was that it was similar with lettuce and strawberry growers, that there was like this 90% of them were sort of meeting some threshold, but then 10 to 20% of them were not.
Ali?
Well, I think we have two approach. you already mentioned, some of you. One, I think what you mentioned, Daniel, is still we go with the crop specific limit, something like that. Okay. And we have another approach, perhaps based on the landscape or region or sub-region, based on, many things. One issue, I'm using this because, from desert, because I can explain what I'm thinking. It's not just about desert. When you look at, desert, if we go with the crop specific, I think is not fair for this perhaps region because they have 200,000 acre forage, and alfalfa, and we don't give them credit in the region for alfalfa, which has the lowest, but we punish them just for 100,000 acres of vegetable crop. I think if we go with landscape for those kind of region, it makes more sense than crops because they have several forage crops. They don't apply that much nitrogen, but perhaps they need to apply for, their vegetables to ensure, and remove their concerns. I think perhaps, I'm trying to say, even we cannot, go with all region with one approach, go landscape or a specific crop, what you mentioned, Daniel.
Mm-hmm.
I think because, there is concerns there.
Thanks. Thomas, you raised your hand.
I was wondering whether what you're proposing, which I like, Daniel, and that approach has been in discussion as early as the discussions we had over the nitrate report in 2012. Whether that approach isn't really sort of, to me, that fits into the second question. I think where we need to be, target limit, et cetera, is going to be something in my mind that meets these drinking water standards, which will have to take into account the mixing that goes in a well, takes into account the contributions of river recharge in the region, managed aquifer recharge in the region, takes into account the typical mixing of different land uses within source areas, et cetera, et cetera. And in the Central Valley, that's what the Central Valley coalitions are doing, is they're essentially taking all of this information that's collected in INMP, they put it in a physical model that reflects what we currently know about these crops and what we know about what's happening in soils. And that then gets fed into the groundwater modeling tool that we've developed to look at what happens in the long run to wells, what's the nitrate levels in those wells, and how much do things need to be reduced. And that's what's been set as a target in the Central Valley at the township level. But then to get there, I think your approach of saying let's take 5-year intervals or 10-year intervals to get, the worst half or the worst 20% to operate like the better 80%, and then do that one more time and do that one more time and do that one more time. I think to me that seems like a good overall strategy that would be good to at least propose and hear feedback on as a way to get there. Not as a way to set a limit or a target, but I think as a strategy to kind of get to where we need to be at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And just one comment, Hannah mentioned the outlier calculation. So that is already being done. Although in the Central Valley, I think the approach the coalitions use right now, at least some of them, I think they may use different approaches. I only looked at some of them, but some of these approaches would not work because what they are doing, they only calculate outliers when the same crop is grown or in the Central Valley, they calculate outliers on the field scale level. And they only calculate it when the same crop is grown on the field over a period of 3 years. which means that orchards have almost 100% chance of being included in an outlier calculation. Annual crops, if the growers have a crop rotation, they will never be included in a outlier calculation. So that, if we go with that approach, I'm strongly in favor of using 3-year averages, but the approach would need to be different so that basically every field has a chance of getting included in an outlier calculation. But that would be something we can discuss later or at a different time. Richard?
Let me see if I can share this screen with you. I don't know if I can.
You should be able to, I think.
Okay.
The green share at the bottom.
Yeah, I mean, but it's not coming up. So anyway, what I wanted to just show you, it's kind of the exact opposite of what you just showed, Daniel. It's the data that Hannah was just referring to from Sarah's percent of total achieving you know, an A-R people at the 50 pounds, which would be our target, right? Or for water quality, there's only 20% of the people, and this is region 3. I'm not sure what year, 2023 is this data. And so the point I'm making is that this issue of double cropping, triple cropping really complicates achieving these you know, like when you talk about an economic versus an agronomic you know, goal, it's trickier here. So like if we were to say who's 80%, well, 80% of the people that are you know, if we're at 300 pounds, you know, that's, you know, 80% of the people are achieving 300 pounds. 50% of the people are achieving 200 pounds. So anyway, sorry I couldn't show that, but you can go into her presentation from the first meeting and you'll see it. But I just wanted to point that out because this is the reality here in Region 3. And we have, you know, we can't get too glib about the economic and the, you know, limit and the agronomic limit in some areas, in this area in particular.
Richard, can I show that? Because I have it up.
Oh, you got it? Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, Donna.
Can you see that? It was green.
The black and gray.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I think, is that what you're referring to, Richard?
Yeah, thank you for showing that.
Then Mike, you have a comment?
Yeah, I sort of wanted to say that what you showed is, I think, in this approach that Preservation Inc. is using, looking at outliers, it works to get growers to what's agronomically possible, but it won't get you beyond that because, you know, if you just can't grow a crop with less, you know, what can you do? So just think about that. And since people are showing slides, I have one that just shows the situation on the Central Coast.
Go ahead.
Let's see if I can share it. See. Oh. So you're here. See that? So that's the limit that's coming up on our ag order. And this is, this is right off of the regional board, Central Coast Region Board's dashboard. So 5 years of data of nitrogen applications to lettuce. And you could see on average is 167 pounds. But, as Richard said, only a portion of that nitrogen is removed. You can see look at all that residue there. So when we do the removal calculation, even a good yield like 900 cartons an acre, it only comes out to about 65 pounds of N per acre using that coefficient that was developed. And so with you have a double crop. This is sort of typical romaine lettuce. And then broccoli, the data shows on average 200 pounds of N per acre applied. So we got the 167, 200, 367. But then the A-R is the A part includes nitrogen in the irrigation water. And we have a lot of wells with high nitrates. And even just accounting for what is part of the water that goes as crop ET, it all adds up to about 124 pounds of N if you had sort of moderate nitrate levels. The 30 seems really high, but that's pretty common here. And so you end up at a total of 491. And then if you subtract off the removal, you're about at 352. So that's just sort of the scenario with the double crop here. And this is pretty, this is the average right now. But we have to get much lower, to protect water quality. And this is why, what Richard said about looking at what is available in the soil, other sources of nitrogen is really important. That's why soil nitrate testing would be important, and really accounting and crediting the nitrogen in the irrigation water and understanding mineralization from, residues that we incorporate over time. Then we have wells, 70, 80 parts per million nitrate in, and growers are not necessarily accounting for that in their nitrogen budgets because of a lot of the complexity. So what we really have to do is have a way to encourage growers to do some of these steps and have also good water management, so we don't leach the nitrogen down because it moves. And they also apply a lot of nitrogen through the irrigation system. So just better irrigation is got to be an important part. And if they did some of these things, okay, we could reduce the fertilizer maybe down to 120 and broccoli down to 180. And this would be making use of the nitrate in the irrigation water there. And we could probably, at least get down to the 300 threshold. This would be great if we could at least, get some growers moving more in this direction. And so I think, yeah, you can use the approach of looking at the outliers that are way beyond what we know is agronomically feasible. But then once you get growers in this situation, the question is then where do you go from there?
So we have about 10 minutes left. So Ngudu, Hannah, and Thomas raised their hand. We probably won't be able to conclude the discussion on that topic today, but Ngudu, Hannah, and Thomas, and then we'll see whether we have more time.
Thank you, Daniel. And thank you, Michael, for sharing those slides. I think education will be very helpful in this whole process, however we proceed, working with growers. I had a question briefly for Ali regarding the deserts. And going back to our earlier conversation about treating each region differently, I think will be helpful. You mentioned the alfalfa growers out there. I'm wondering if you know how much they contribute to nitrates in groundwater, or how much just what their nitrogen application looks like in the desert compared to like the other regions.
Well, good question. Still, I'm developing the crop coefficient for alfalfa. In terms of removal, this we have so far 9 months, so I don't have the entire 1 year, but I can give you, my estimation. So my estimation is in removal for alfalfa in the desert is somewhere around 750 pound per acre. That's a removal. So that's a big removal. I think perhaps the highest in the state, because there are some numbers, 600 something in different region. But in terms of application, growers, they don't apply that much. The average should be 100 something maximum, the average. So if you look at that, if you go with just crop, we don't give them any credit, because it's minus 600 something, or less, because, as you might know, Colorado River doesn't have any nitrate. So is 0.2, part per millions is almost nothing. So no credit from water, basically, no application, and, a lot of removal.
Thank you. Hannah?
Yeah, I just have a new question now after Michael just went. Michael, I was wondering if that can, like, from what you know with Eric Brennan's studies and the cover crop credit, like, would any of, or how would those numbers change if there's a cover crop? And then also, in terms of the large amounts of residue, from lettuce to broccoli, the residues aren't considered in the ag order in terms of a source, correct? Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay, and so, yeah, I guess perhaps some, I think I know that, or I think you might be doing research on this already, but having that accounted for the next crop, I don't know if that could help. Yeah, how would that change the mass balance?
Are you asking crediting the residue for the next crop?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that is credited through, the best way is you test the soil, using the quick nitrate test. There's always a possibility to leach that out before you ever plant the crop, because there's pre-irrigation that happens, germination, and by the time the crop needs the nitrogen, you could have put on, 5, 6, 7 inches of water, and that's beyond the root zone because it's a shallow root crop. So that's why the irrigation management is so important, to keep that nitrogen from the previous crop available for the next crop. And then you asked about cover crops. Well, that is really a practice that growers are going to have to do if you want to get that 300 or 280 down to something more like 200, right? If you could have more, I guess, non-legume cover crops that would take it up into the winter time, that would be very beneficial.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I want to cut you off, Mike.
No, maybe Richard wants to add to that.
No, I think you said it, Mike. The R side of the equation is really, really important for the Central Coast, for the growers to achieve the get anywhere near the the 50-pound limit or goal, or whatever you want to call it. I guess the thing that I think is important is to keep in mind we can say, yeah, use cover crops. That's not so easy in the Central Coast area because of the scheduling issues with the land. We start planting lettuce in January, and the coal crops start planting them early. So there's scheduling issues that get in the way of growers using a cover crop, and then there's also kind of the use of cover crops gets dampened because growers don't want to be working wet soil in the spring. So there's those kind of issues. That said, I've been talking with some growers here recently, and we used to say, okay, about 5% of the ground in the Salinas Valley gets cover crop, but that's starting to change. And two notable growers that I just interviewed recently were telling me that they're up to over 10%. Now you may say, okay, that's kind of lukewarm, but that's double, than what they were using. So I think that as we go through this process, hopefully we can educate growers about, find ways to include cover crops as much as you can. And then there's other aspects of cover crops we won't go into right now that could also increase their usage. So anyway.
Great, thank you. Thomas, we have about 3 or 4 minutes left until we have to open for public
I was going to
comment.
ask Michael whether I was going to ask whether Michael could put up his slide number 12 that he last showed. And then I'm really curious to better understand the limitations of not being able to get the A-R to be much tighter than that in lettuce and broccoli. The first question I have is, it seems it was the broccoli where, if I remember this correctly, where we heard that broccoli really kind of scours a lot of the nitrogen and tends to be under-fertilized, which these data are not reflecting. Broccoli is fertilized to its uptake. The other question I have, so that's one question on this. The other question that I have is why it's not possible to use more of the N that comes with the irrigation water as a nitrogen credit. Is that because you just can't be that efficient with your irrigation at the time that's needed? Or is it because your irrigation water is so little that when most of the nitrogen is needed, it doesn't have enough? And then at a later point, when more water is needed, the uptake is way less than what's even there in irrigation water? I don't quite get it.
I don't know, Mike, can you answer these questions in 1 minute, or
Yeah. So
for next time?
So even
Sorry, Thomas.
Even though we apply maybe 180 pounds or maybe sometimes it's 160 pounds of N per broccoli actually takes up almost 300 pounds of nitrogen per acre. So it takes up more than they apply. And then, pretty much all the nitrate in the water, at least equal to crop ET, is plant available. The reason we don't include all the applied water is we have pre-irrigation, we have establishment where we're putting the water on before there's a crop or much uptake. And so we worked it out with the regional board to just include ET, the volume equal to ET, or for vineyards, what is applied, whichever is less, the least, right? But it is all plant available. It's just that growers don't yet take all that nitrogen into account in their calculations. Some do, but a lot don't.
Thank you. So I think, do you all agree that we haven't finished the discussion yet on question 1, that we need to continue next time?
Yeah.
So what about for next time? So we meet again on the 22nd. That would be next Wednesday, same time. Shall we set our goals to continue with question 1? Question 2 is related, and probably if we have time, at the most tackle question 3 and 4, but that would be the maximum for next time. And then I was wondering, we heard several different ideas. I presented an approach. Thomas presented a landscape approach. Ali had some ideas for the Imperial Valley. Probably Richard and Mike, you may have some additional considerations for the Central Coast. Should we all try to summarize our ideas and then send it to the water board so that we have something written for next time where we can continue our discussion? Would that be possible? If others, Hanan, Gudu, Ruth, if you have other ideas too, just summarize it so that we have something, the different ideas, basically a list of different approaches we discussed so that we could continue there next time. Would that be a possibility to do? Or would you have the capacity to summarize your approach in a short or not so short paragraph?
Yeah, could do that.
Great. And then shall we send it to Sam or Erica? But who would collect these and put together?
If you could send it to both of us, that would be lovely.
Okay, great. So then I guess we have to open the discussion now or for comments by the public. But thanks everybody. It was a great discussion. A lot of ideas, and so let's continue next week. Hopefully, you all can join again. That would be great because everybody has a different point of view to look at things. That was very valuable. Okay, then Sam, I'll let you moderate the comments by the attendees.
Well, thank you, and thank you all for joining today. Great to see progress being made on this and really substantial substantive discussion on the questions. We will go ahead and move to public comment now. So this is a little different than we've done for the listening sessions and for the panel meetings themselves. We would like to keep public comment to no more than 3 minutes apiece, and I know we just have a few minutes for it, but we'll go ahead and use the hand raise feature for any members of the public who would like to provide public comment.
We do have an initial comment request that we received from Tess. So
I got that. Thank you, Adelia. So we'll go with Tess Dunham followed by Zoe Robertson. And again, we would ask that you keep your comments to 3 minutes or less. So we'll go ahead and start with Tess. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you all for a really wonderful discussion. Really appreciate that today. I know it's late. People would like dinner. There's an NFL football game on. It's Monday night. Sam, Erica, come on. It's football. No, actually, thank you so much. This was a really great discussion, which I really appreciate from all of you. I just wanted to provide a little bit of context and share with you a couple of sentences that the Third District Court of Appeal stated when it decided the case with respect to the East San Joaquin order, which is a fundamental part of this whole discussion with respect to the irrigated lands program. And the court, I think, sums up the complexity that you're all dealing with. The court says, regulating waste discharges from irrigated agriculture involves an unusually complex set of policy judgments and trade-offs. Regulators must balance the need to ensure a reliable food supply and preserve the economic viability of agriculture against the need to protect waters of the state. That's the court. That was the Court of Appeal in upholding the State Water Board's determination on the East San Joaquin order. And I think it's important because it really highlights, I think, some of the challenges many of you have expressed in your comments today with respect to the need to protect water quality and the need to reflect, but what is agronomically feasible, right? I mean, there is going to be a balance here that I know you're all going to struggle with. But I would share that Port Cologne is, if anything, it's a model of flexibility. And in your policy and in your recommendations, and you can't avoid the policy discussion, it just goes hand in hand. But in your recommendations as to what is potentially agronomically feasible, is that consideration of the balance that the regional board and the state water board are going to need to make. So just want to remind you, and limits are not a requirement of the law. It's unfortunate in my mind, and we submitted some significant comments on this on the draft questions when they were put forward, that the way that that panel question was written, it's a little bit leading in that it suggests that limits are the only option. I don't believe that's true. Many of you have expressed, whether it's targets, whatever, that scope is open. I think that's a pretty important part of your conversation and the balance that you're all going to have to take into consideration. I'm more than happy to come back and talk to you about what enforceability means in an enforcement context, and whether that's a panel of different perspectives might be useful. I do enforcement actions all the time. There's a water quality enforcement policy that the state follows when it takes on administrative civil liabilities. And there are significant penalties. So if you think about, could a grower meet a limit of 27 pounds or 50 pounds, and they don't, it is a per day violation. Potentially $1,000 to $5,000 per day. That's a whole growing season. These could be astronomical. So I think you need to balance that. And I'm not saying we shouldn't protect water quality, but we also need to balance with what we're doing to protect the users. That's why in the Central Valley, the management zones and the growers are providing drinking water to those whose wells have exceeded the nitrate standard. There are ways for us to make sure that people have safe drinking water while protecting our agronomic feasibility of agriculture in the valley, in the coast, and in other areas of the state. So I just want to make sure we keep the full picture and think about that. I know there's a lot, but thank you for all your time. And Sam, I'm probably at my time limit.
Yes, thank you. All right, next up we'll go to Zoe Robertson. Zoe, please.
Hi, good evening. My name is Zoe Robertson, and I'm a third-year student at Stanford Law School. I spent the last year reviewing annual reporting by confined animal feeding operations across the state, and my comments today are intended to highlight the significant quantities of nitrogen that are produced by CAFOs that go unaccounted for in reporting. And this comment goes to the panel's earlier discussion of cattle and dairy contributions to environmental nitrogen. Under the relevant waste discharge requirements, CAFOs are required to perform quote-unquote whole farm nutrient accounting in their annual reports. To do so, CAFOs are, like irrigated lands, required to tabulate an AR value. In theory, the nutrients produced by animals on the farm in the form of manure should be equal to the nutrients applied to on-site fields plus the nutrients that are exported from the farm. But from our research, this was not the case for 137 of the 170 CAFO annual reports from 2023 that we reviewed in the Central Valley region, otherwise known as Region 5. One farm, for instance, left 1,300,000 pounds of nitrogen unaccounted for. It is unclear where that nitrogen is going if it's not being applied to fields or exported from the farm. It makes us believe it could be leaching. And our data likely underestimates the scope of this problem because of how growers report applying nitrogen to fields. The annual reports that we reviewed presumed that all fields prior to manure application had zero existing nitrogen content whatsoever. In other words, growers do not account for rolling nitrogen across years, or as you discussed earlier in the meeting, the amount of residue left from previous plantings. This presumption not only renders the final AR value unreliable because fields with pre-existing nutrients cannot uptake nitrogen at the same rates as barren fields, but it also suggests that nitrogen is simply not being taken up by crops to the extent anticipated by CAFO reporting, at least in Region 5. The bottom line is that we may be significantly underestimating how much nitrogen is entering the environment through this pathway. Our findings suggest that the panel should evaluate how to account for this significant additional source of nitrogen and adopt a more conservative approach than it might absent these findings. We are happy to further communicate on this issue with the panel as it proves useful. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. All right, I see two additional hands up. We'll go to Sarah Lopez, followed by Kaya Rivers. Sarah.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you. First of all, just a big thank you to the panel members for the very insightful discussions today. I was really encouraged by the content of today's discussions. I felt like they were very on point and that they're very reflective of other discussions that I've been a part of on these same topics. So it's feeling like there's some consensus of opinion about which big agronomic and hydrogeologic issues we're faced with here and about the challenges that the various grower groups face. And I think that that's a good thing. Two quick technical points. One is regarding the issue of carryover of A-R across calendar years when when there's a crop that spans 2 calendar years, but the reporting period ends on December 31st. I think Michael Kahn did a good job of describing the 3-year averaging, but there is another issue on the Central Coast that's we're still scratching our heads about at Preservation Inc., which is the issue of it's the strawberry lettuce rotation and the issue of ranches actually changing hands across years. And so in the Central Coast, everything is there's no anonymity or data privacy, so every report is associated with a global ID. And so when the ranch actually changes operator, the global ID changes. And so we're still thinking about how do you track reports, how do you track the A-R across multiple years when the global ID associated with that parcel of land changes within a 3-year period. So just want to throw that out there. And then Sam, do I have another minute here?
That 1 minute, 10 seconds. Go for it.
Okay. The other issue I'm going to have a hard time articulating, so maybe fodder for future discussion, but Dr. Harder kind of alluded to in his, the map depicting his underground view of the world and talking about capture areas and mixing of groundwaters influencing individual wells being on the order of maybe a square mile or a few. And I just wanted to, and so then that kind of supporting the idea that loading could then be kind of averaged across an area, and perhaps that would maybe bring some relief to individual growers within that area in terms of loading limitations. And I just wanted to very unfortunately discourage optimism on that concept for valley floor areas of the Central Coast. So just take a look, take that concept in your mind and take a look at a map of the Santa Maria Valley floor and the Salinas Valley floor. Just initially exploring that concept. I think a lot of people need to keep looking at it, but we were not optimistic after initially exploring that concept. Thank you.
Sarah. All right, we'll go to Kaya Rivers, followed by Elias Rodriguez.
Hi, good afternoon, or maybe good evening. My name is Kaya Rivers. I'm a senior policy advocate at Community Water Center, and it's been really insightful listening to your conversation today and understanding what extra data this group may need to answer the charge questions from the State Water Board. And I agree, it's really important that the panel has all the information that it needs in order to make progress towards reducing nitrogen discharges and protecting water quality in the state of California and protecting drinking water. And I just wanted to make some quick comments. My colleague, Daniel Rath from NRDC has developed a really great literature review looking at how other countries have set limits on nitrogen discharge. And we've seen that acreage data was a really useful data to have to set these limits on nitrogen discharge in these countries. The Central Coast has already compiled data for growers' nitrogen discharge rates alongside the acreage of growers' operations to understand the true extent of discharge in the region. And this is really great. However, the information for the Central Valley region on acreage is not publicly available at this time. However, it'd be really important to have and really crucial to have as this panel starts thinking about how we can reduce nitrogen discharges. I know that there's been some talk about starting at the dischargers who are discharging the most nitrogen. So the Central Valley coalitions have years of acreage data that can further help the panel understand what limits can be set to protect water quality. And the State Water Board also has the authority to request this acreage discharge from the coalitions. And I really urge the panel to ask the State Water Board for this acreage data in addition to all the data that you're looking to request for future conversations as well. Thank you for the time.
Thank you, Kaya. We'll go to Elias Rodriguez, followed by Mary Hamilton.
Hi, everyone. My name is Elias Rodriguez. I'm a staff attorney with California Rural Legal Assistance, and we work with communities impacted by nitrate contamination in their drinking water. And I appreciate the discussion today. It was very insightful. Thank you for everyone's time and energy in the discussion. I especially appreciated the way panelist member Michael Kahn was describing how to get growers down to a discharge limit that is agronomically feasible. And I want to just raise attention to the lack of the lack of I guess selection in question one of discharge limits and application limits, because there was a lot of discussion around discharge limits and not much about application limits. Daniel Rass literature review pointed to countries and agricultural practices in other countries that showed drastic reductions in nitrate contamination after application limits were set. So I would encourage the panel to consider the application limits perhaps in conjunction with discharge limits. Thank you.
Thank you, Elias. Okay, Mary Hamilton, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for your time today. It's amazing to see that so many people have been able to stay on this long. I'll keep it really short. I just wanted to follow up on enforceability and the flexibility that Dr. Harder asked about and limits. And a couple of things I wanted to make sure everyone's aware of is in developing Ag Order 4.0 for the Central Coast, we tried to build in some of that flexibility, creating a escalating sequence of consequences in our order. So missing a limit or a target for multiple years resulted in first follow-up and then requirements for certifying an INMP report. And then maybe individual monitoring should the executive officer decide that was warranted to further characterize the extent and magnitude of the loading. All of that would be happening before we would consider going to formal enforcement, which would result in fines. And secondly, should we follow a progressive enforcement approach, which I'll just keep it brief to say the example that Sarah provided last week, where she talked about a couple of civil liability cases. Those occurred only after a multi-year effort to try and reach and support those growers so that they would report their nitrogen applied information, and only recalcitrant growers ended up in the situation where we pursued civil liability. So I just wanted to point out that, missing a target is, we don't lead with fines and that type of enforcement. We tried to build in flexibility and escalating series of consequences that would hopefully result in education and change. And then also we take a progressive approach that's multiple years of trying before we would consider going to the fines. And I'll end there.
Thanks so much, Mary. We do have a few minutes left. If anybody, I guess exactly 1 minute, if anybody else would like to make a comment. Hannah, go ahead.
Sorry, I'm just wanting to clarify what we're sending you. Can it be beyond sort of what our approach would be to this and sort of comments on things that have been said that we agree or don't agree with, or?
Certainly send it over and we'll do our best. I know many of us have been taking detailed notes throughout the discussion. And as Daniel mentioned at the front of the meeting, we'll do our best to summarize that, including the additional information you'll send.
Probably focus on question 1. You can send anything, but question 1 is really the topic, or we will continue next time, and all the other questions will come later. But you can, whatever you feel needs to be send it. But with a focus on question 1, that would be question 1 and 2, because they're really closely related.
And sorry, what's the deadline for that?
The sooner the better, since you have another one of these meetings coming up next week. But I don't know, maybe end of the week, if possible.
Okay. Okay, thanks.
Right. So we are at time, as a number of people pointed out. I know that you're all staying late on your Monday. I do want to go first to Daniel for any closing comments, and then I believe Karen is still on as well. Karen, if you have any closing thoughts. Daniel?
So yeah, I'd just like to thank everybody. First of all, everybody on the panel. We had a great discussion. Looking forward to continuing next week. And then thank you, Sam, and the Water Board for organizing this meeting, and everybody listening and commenting at the end. So thanks a lot for participation and contributions.
Wonderful, thank you. And I did notice there's a hand up from staff at Kelly, PA.
Hi, yeah, I just wanted to clarify the timeline on that. So the sooner we get those, the sooner we can start summarizing materials prior to the next meeting.
Right. Yeah. Thanks, Delia.
Yeah.
Karen.
Well, you didn't disappoint me today at all. I had high expectations and you delivered. So thank you so much for the great conversation and for your time and your thoughtfulness. I look forward to more discussion next week. Time well spent. Thank you.
All right. Well, with that, we're 2 minutes over. We'll go ahead and close out for the evening. I hope everybody has a chance to take a relaxing evening, and we'll see you all next week. Take care, all. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
Recording stopped.